Okay, so the other night here on the 208, Brian Holmes and we talked in passing briefly about the history of primary elections in Idaho. And we mentioned real quickly that in the early 1900s, the state of Idaho actually had a really brief run with what we would now call a ranked choice election. To be honest, Brian and our team, we were searching for more details from that era, the early 1900s, to provide you some history and what primary elections have looked like over the last several hundred years. Well, retired Secretary of State Ben Yesursa was actually able to get us a copy of the 1981-82 Idaho Blue Book. And that Blue Book, by the way, it still gets printed. It's digitally on the Secretary of State site, and it contains a lot of great information about Idaho government, history, maps, facts, really a cool read if you feel like digging into it. But the 81-82 version of the Blue Book had a great article about the history of primary elections in Idaho. Take a look at the abridged history of Idaho primaries. It's a tale of change. If you want to talk about the complete history of Idaho primaries, we better go all the way back to the 1900s. We'll start in 1910 when Idaho had their first direct primary law. Idaho was an early adopter of direct primaries, and they introduced preferential voting in 1910, allowing voters to rank the candidates. Sound familiar? The significance is it actually marked the first attempt at giving voters direct influence in a candidate selection. About 8 years later, though, in 1918, is when we saw the repeal of that first direct primary law. There were problems with preferential voting, and party disruption became apparent. There was voter abuse using the preferential voting system, people writing in fake or unknown candidates, and then the nonpartisan league actually disrupted the Democratic primary. As a result, the Republican-controlled legislature repealed that direct primary law. And of note, Republican Senator William Borah continued to support direct primaries despite the big repeal. In 1930, Democratic governor candidate C. Ben Ross campaigned on reinstating direct primaries, and in 1931, then Governor Ross built a coalition of support for that new direct primary bill. In 1932, the new direct primary law passed, and it was significant because, under the new laws, it was dispelling fears of party disruption. It reestablished voter participation in the nomination process. Fast forward to 1937, though, it was the introduction of the open primary system. A key change: voters could obtain ballots for either party regardless of their affiliation. There was a concern at the time for potential party raiding. And the first major party raiding incident happened in 1938. DeWorth Clark defeated the incumbent James Pope in a Democratic senatorial primary, and there was suspected crossover voting in that race because of the candidate's opposition to New Deal policies. In the 1960s, Idaho had a 2-year runoff election experiment that nobody seemed to like. It was abandoned in 1962 after extremely low voter turnout. And then in the mid-1960s, there was the call-for ballot system for a very brief time. And at that point, voters were required to request a specific party ballot at their polling place. But it was quickly abandoned because there was public outcry about having to declare a party preference. Into the year 1968, that's when we saw a pre-primary convention system that ran until 1971. It gave the political parties more control over their nominations. Those parties could endorse candidates before the primary election. But again, it was repealed in 1971 due to intra-party conflicts, representation concerns, bringing Idaho back to the open direct primary. Idaho stayed the course for the most part until the 1980s, where there was ongoing debate and adjustments. At that point, they moved some election dates around, but there was still a pretty good system here with the open primary. But that changed in 2007 when the Idaho Republican Party decided that they too were concerned about crossover voting. In 2007, the action was started to close the primary, and officially in 2011, Governor Butch Otter did sign a law that gave the option to political parties to close their primary. In 2012, the Idaho Republican Party held their first closed primary election. It remains that way till this day. Great work from Kevin Esslinger to help take us along the timeline. So, if Proposition 1 passed, this would just be another chapter in Idaho's evolution of elections. And speaking of Prop 1, you can find all the answers to your questions at KTVB.com. We now have our voter guide up. You can text VOTE, V-O-T-E, to 208-321-5614, and we will send you that guide almost instantaneously. Meanwhile, though, keep those election and proposition questions coming. We will continue to answer them up until Election Day.